Forget what your history books told you. Before Columbus, before the empires, there was a nightmare from the north that changed everything. And it wasn't just about the axes. They came from the cold north, sailing across seas with unmatched skill and unshakable courage. To some, they were brutal raiders. To others, they were skilled craftsmen, explorers, and visionaries. The Vikings left behind more than just ruins and fear. They changed the course of history. From the shores of England to the rivers of Russia, their impact is still felt today. But who were they, really? What drove them to venture so far from home, and why do their stories still fascinate us centuries later? In this video, we uncover the truth behind the legends of the Vikings.
The image of a Viking is often one of violence, a warrior with an axe and a helmet. But history paints a more complex picture. The Vikings were farmers, shipbuilders, poets, and navigators. They created sophisticated trade routes that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Middle East. Their longships were engineering marvels, built for speed, stealth, and strength. At home, they lived in tightly knit communities with distinct laws and customs. Women in Viking society held more rights than in many other parts of the medieval world. Their belief system shaped every part of life, blending myth, fate, and honor. While they did launch brutal raids, especially in the 9th and 10th centuries, they also founded cities, kingdoms, and cultures. Dublin in Ireland and Novgorod in Russia are just two examples of Viking influence that still stand. They were not a single people, but a network of Scandinavian clans with shifting alliances. Their writing, carved in runes, survives on stones and artifacts. They passed stories down through generations, building a cultural legacy that outlived their conquests. Understanding the Vikings means going beyond the blood and battle. It means recognizing the complexity behind the legend. And it all begins with where they came from.
Long before they set sail, the roots of Viking culture grew deep in the forests and fjords of Scandinavia. The rugged landscape shaped a people who valued strength, resilience, and independence. Life was hard, and survival depended on unity, skill, and constant adaptation. Small chieftain-led communities formed the backbone of early Viking society. They farmed, fished, and occasionally fought among themselves. But something began to change in the late 8th century. Pressures from population growth, shifting trade routes, and political unrest pushed them outward. They looked beyond their homeland, not only for wealth, but for opportunity. And once they set sail, the world would never be the same again.
The Viking Age officially began in 793 with a raid on Lindisfarne, but its roots run much deeper. Long before their ships reached foreign shores, Scandinavian communities were evolving into something more powerful. Climate shifts led to improved agricultural techniques, allowing populations to grow. Trade with neighboring regions introduced new goods, ideas, and ambitions. Tribal leaders began to consolidate power, turning local chieftains into regional rulers. With growing numbers and rising competition, expansion became not just desirable, it became necessary. Scandinavian warriors started testing distant coasts, seeking not just plunder, but prestige. At first, their journeys were seasonal, but over time, they became permanent presences in foreign lands. They followed rivers deep into Eastern Europe, settled along the coasts of Britain, and reached as far as Iceland and Greenland. These early voyages were both explorations and expressions of cultural confidence. Their ability to adapt and integrate allowed them to form alliances as well as empires. Viking settlements often blended with local populations, creating new hybrid cultures. What began as a search for survival became a story of expansion and transformation. The Vikings were not just reacting to their world, they were reshaping it, and they did so with unmatched determination and purpose.
When the Vikings arrived on foreign shores, they didn't just bring weapons, they brought a new kind of warfare. Their attacks were fast, unpredictable, and often unstoppable. They used rivers as highways, striking deep into the heart of kingdoms that believed themselves safe. Fortresses, monasteries, and cities fell with alarming speed. But these raids were more than brutality. They were strategies. The Vikings targeted wealth, weakened rivals, and created pathways for settlement. In time, their tactics forced European powers to change how they defended their lands. New fortifications, military reforms, and even legal systems were developed in response. The Viking threat demanded evolution, and that evolution changed the shape of Europe.
Viking warfare was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Their longships gave them a tactical advantage, able to sail in shallow waters, cross open seas, and appear where no army was expected. They struck monasteries and trade centers not only for wealth, but for psychological impact. Their unpredictability made them nearly impossible to prepare for. Yet the Vikings were not just raiders. They were masterful organizers. They coordinated large-scale assaults across multiple fronts, sometimes combining forces from different clans. In some regions, they formed temporary alliances with local powers, turning enemies into collaborators. Their control over rivers like the Seine, the Thames, and the Dnieper gave them both access and dominance. These waterways became corridors of invasion, trade, and influence. Viking warfare disrupted traditional power structures. Frankish kings, Anglo-Saxon rulers, and Slavic leaders were forced to rethink their defenses. Some paid tribute to avoid destruction. Others fortified cities and improved standing armies. In the process, Europe began to modernize its military and political systems. The Vikings introduced not just destruction, but transformation. Their raids exposed weakness, but more importantly, they provoked change.
To understand the Viking warrior, you must first understand what he believed the Norse gods were not distant. They walked among people, shaped battles, and guided fate. Odin the All-Father gave wisdom but demanded sacrifice. Thor defended mankind with his hammer, representing strength and honor. Death was not an end but a journey. Warriors who died in battle were believed to enter Valhalla, a hall of eternal glory. This belief gave Viking fighters a fearlessness in combat few others could match. Their worldview was shaped by cycles of struggle, destiny, and renewal. Myths were not just stories, they were instructions for how to live, fight, and die. Every raid, every voyage, every challenge was part of something greater, and this faith was carved into the heart of their culture.
The spiritual world of the Vikings was rich, layered, and deeply woven into daily life. Their gods reflected the harsh beauty of the world they lived in, imperfect, powerful, and bound by fate. Odin sacrificed an eye for wisdom, symbolizing the price of knowledge. Loki, the trickster, embodied chaos, reminding people that life could turn at any moment. The cosmology of the Norse placed 9 realms connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. Midgard was the realm of humans, but others included lands of giants, gods, and the dead. Rituals were held to honor the gods, often near sacred trees or stone circles. Sacrifice was a form of communication, not just offering. It was an exchange. Runes were more than writing, they were believed to carry magical properties. Even objects like swords and ships were decorated with symbols to invoke protection or favor. Mythological tales were passed orally, blending entertainment with moral lessons and historical memory. These stories reminded Viking warriors of the impermanence of life and the honor of death in battle. Their belief system did not separate the sacred from the everyday. The divine was present in storms, in harvests, in victories, and in loss. This worldview shaped how Vikings saw themselves, not as invaders but as participants in a grand, fated struggle.
Viking culture was not built on scrolls or libraries. It lived through stories. Spoken aloud in longhouses and by firelight, their sagas carried memory across generations. These tales told of voyages, betrayals, victories, and divine encounters. Heroes and ancestors were remembered not in ink, but in voice. Runes, carved into wood, stone, and metal, recorded names, blessings, and brief histories. But most of their knowledge lived in the minds of skalds, poets, and storytellers. Their role was vital, to keep the past alive. Through them, even the dead spoke again. In Viking culture, to be remembered was to remain powerful, and memory itself became a form of immortality.
Long before written records became common, the Vikings used oral tradition to preserve their past. Their sagas were epic narratives that blended history, myth, and moral instruction. Passed down through generations, these stories kept memories of exploration, family honor, and divine will alive. Skalds, or Norse poets, played a central role in maintaining these traditions. They recited sagas at feasts, battles, and funerals, ensuring that even those who died would not be forgotten. These stories served not only as entertainment, but as historical memory. In the absence of formal archives, the human voice became the Viking library. Runes supported this oral tradition with brief inscriptions carved into stone or wood. Each rune carried sound, meaning, and sometimes spiritual weight. They marked graves, blessed weapons, and declared ownership of land. Some stones were erected not just as monuments, but as declarations of legacy. Through runes and sagas, the Vikings preserved details of journeys, feuds, and alliances. Even distant events were remembered vividly through carefully chosen words. This fusion of memory and myth ensured that history lived on, not as fact alone, but as feeling and identity. In Viking culture, forgetting was a greater loss than death itself.
While history often remembers the Vikings as raiders, there is another side to their legacy. They were skilled merchants who traded fur, amber, iron, and slaves across vast distances. Their trade networks reached as far as Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. In cities like Hedeby and Birka, markets thrived with goods and ideas. They exchanged not just products, but technologies, languages, and beliefs. Many Vikings settled in the lands they once raided, becoming farmers and rulers. Some even married into local nobility, blending cultures and bloodlines. Their settlements in Normandy, the British Isles, and Eastern Europe left permanent marks. Through trade and colonization, they became part of the very civilizations they once challenged. And in doing so, they reshaped the map of the medieval world.
As much as they were warriors, the Vikings were also master navigators. Their voyages were driven not just by conquest, but by curiosity and necessity. They explored uncharted waters and discovered lands far beyond their homeland. From establishing Dublin in Ireland to founding settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even reaching North America, their journeys redefined the edges of the known world. In these distant places, they often became more than visitors. They built communities. Archaeological finds in Newfoundland confirm that Viking explorers reached the New World centuries before Columbus. In the east, they navigated the rivers of modern-day Russia, founding key trading hubs like Novgorod and Kiev. These routes connected them to Byzantium and the Islamic world, where they exchanged gross silver and stories. They brought back silk, spices, and coins from places most Europeans had never seen. This exposure to different civilizations subtly influenced their own. They absorbed ideas in architecture, shipbuilding, and governance. Rather than destroying, they often adapted and blended into local societies. Their legacy as settlers challenges the one-dimensional image of the Viking as merely a destroyer. It reveals a people capable of building as well as breaking. A people driven by more than violence, driven by ambition, opportunity, and resilience.
At first, the Vikings stood outside the boundaries of European order, foreign, fierce, and feared. But as time passed, they began to integrate into the very systems they once defied. Conversion to Christianity marked a turning point. What began as political alliance slowly became spiritual transformation. Viking leaders adopted Christian names, built churches, and formed royal dynasties. In Normandy, descendants of Viking settlers would one day rule England. In Scandinavia, kings emerged to unify once fragmented clans. With religion came new forms of law, diplomacy, and written history. The raiders had become rulers, and their place in Europe was no longer as outsiders, but as shapers of its future.
The transformation of the Vikings from raiders to royalty was neither sudden nor simple. It unfolded over generations, shaped by diplomacy, war, and necessity. As Christian influence spread across Europe, conversion became both a spiritual shift and a political tool. Viking chieftains who once defied bishops began sponsoring churches. Their children were baptized, their oaths sworn on Bibles rather than axes. In Scandinavia, leaders like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason merged old customs with new beliefs, founding kingdoms on the edge of tradition and change. Christianity offered access to alliances, trade networks, and legitimacy. With religion came writing, law codes, and statecraft. Viking rulers started minting coins, issuing decrees, and building towns that rivaled those in the rest of Europe. These new monarchies forged national identities that still exist today. But traces of the old gods and warrior culture remained, hidden in folklore, festivals, and family names. The Norse worldview did not vanish, it evolved. And in this transformation, the Vikings secured a legacy that extended beyond battlefields and into the heart of European civilization.
Centuries after the last Viking ship vanished over the horizon, their legacy remains vivid. We see it in literature, where Norse mythology inspires novels, films, and games. In language, many English words, like sky, knife, and window, have Viking roots. In place names across Britain, Ireland, and even Russia, their presence is still written on the land. Museums hold their artifacts, but stories keep their spirit alive. The idea of the fearless explorer still captures our imagination. Historians continue to discover new layers of Viking life, revealing complexity behind the legends. Not just warriors, but thinkers, builders, and changers of history. Their memory lives not just in books, but in identity. And in that way, the Vikings have never truly left.
The Viking legacy endures not just in history books, but in the very structure of our modern world. Across Scandinavia, ancient burial mounds and runestones stand as silent witnesses to a dynamic past. In Britain, archaeological digs continue to uncover Viking swords, jewelry, and homes, evidence of a culture that once blended with local traditions. In Iceland, the sagas are still read as part of national identity, preserving the voices of a time when stories were history. Viking influence even appears in democracy. Their early assemblies, or things, inspired systems of local governance. Maritime museums across Europe showcase their innovations in shipbuilding, long, narrow vessels that inspired later naval design. Cultural festivals revive their myths and crafts, attracting people from around the world. The modern fascination with Vikings often centers on their strength, but their resilience and adaptability are what truly shaped their long-term impact. Scientists now use DNA studies to trace Viking migration patterns, linking people across continents through shared ancestry. Even in the digital age, their presence lives on through popular media, from films to games, sparking curiosity in new generations. Viking influence also touched art, architecture, and symbolic design, many of which remain embedded in Scandinavian aesthetics. Their belief in honor, legacy, and exploration continues to resonate in a world still defined by borders and bravery. The echo of Viking footsteps is faint, but it never truly faded. Instead, it lingers in stone, language, and spirit. A reminder that history's greatest journeys never really end. They become part of who we are.
The story of the Vikings is not just about war, it is about transformation. They challenged the world and changed with it, leaving a legacy that shaped nations, cultures, and minds. From raiders to rulers, from outcasts to legends, their journey was far more complex than we often imagine. Their bravery, curiosity, and relentless drive left permanent marks on history. We still walk in their footsteps, speak their words, and carry their stories. The Vikings remind us that history is never static. It evolves with every discovery, every question, and every voice that dares to remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the Viking world. If you found this video inspiring, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of our past. Together, we will keep the legends alive.